Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national television channel, about India's foreign policy, India's international relations, and how India is a good global citizen and promoting global public goods. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up a very important theme of Indian foreign policy, which is its South-South cooperation with the continent of Africa. The African Union has 55 member countries, and it's a big collective, and India has bilateral relations with many of them at a very high level. But then we are looking at the continent as a whole, India's approach to Africa, and what are its unique attributes, and the benefits that India-Africa cooperation generates for people of both sides. And to discuss this, I have a very distinguished guest with me. Joining us in the studio today, Dr. Ruchita Beri. Dr. Beri is a senior Africa expert in India. She's worked in the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis for a long time and has headed the Africa Research and Policy Advocacy. Dr. Beri, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you so much, Sreeram.
Dr. Beri, when we talk about India-Africa cooperation, there are so many elements to it, so many facets. But if you look at the big picture, how would you characterize India's approach to Africa and under the South-South rubric, and what is distinct about it? I mean, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has outlined some of our core values and principles in Kampala, Uganda a few years ago. But please tell the audience, what is it that India does when it goes to Africa, when it engages with Africa, and what is the core ideation behind India-Africa cooperation?
Sreeram, first of all, let me share with you that India-Africa relations are very old. They go back to ancient times. There was contact between India and Africa, some part of Africa in the Indus Valley civilization also. That's how old our relationship is. So it's not new. But in recent years, we have been focusing on the fact that our relationship with Africa is based on a partnership. It is not a donor-client relationship in terms of development partnership. It's something which is unique, and the uniqueness of the relationship is emphasized, I think, by 3 points I would like to make about that. That there are 3 important features, and there are 3 C's of India's development partnership. I'm saying development partnership because if you look at India's development cooperation with Africa, lines of credit as an important instrument of India's development cooperation with Africa, 40% of them are directed towards Africa. So obviously, Africa as an important area of cooperation. Now, what are the 3 features that I'm talking about, which make India's relationship or India's approach with Africa so unique? First is that it is a policy which is based on consultation. It is consultative, that we say that our relationship with Africa is based on their own priorities, on the African countries' demands. And here again I would like to mention Prime Minister Narendra Modi. During his address to the Ugandan Parliament in Kampala, he mentioned that Africa will be, our partnership will be driven by the African priorities. And this is something which we have kept in mind. We are looking at in each and every meeting that has taken place, we have kept the African priorities in place in that. And this is reflected in the fact that Africa, we have said in the India-Africa Forum Summit on 2015 that that our partnership will be driven by the Africa Agenda 2063, which is a vision document developed by the African countries about how they want the continent to be in future. So that's been our focus, that we are looking at African demands and priorities.
Sure.
Second important feature of India's partnership, development partnership in particular, is that it is based on capacity building. Capacity building, particularly human resource development. We have focused on human resource development, and again, if you look at the African plans and policies and priorities, they also call about bringing a skills and education revolution in Africa. That's what Agenda 2063 talks of. So, you know, there is a kind of parity between what India is thinking about its approach to Africa and what the Africans want.
Sure.
So, it is driven by, again, the African needs, and also it is focused on capacity building, human resource development, and that's an important area within India's development paradigm also. It has been focusing on skills enhancement, and in Africa also it's doing that. Third is that India's approach to Africa is collaborative, that we are collaborating with African countries in building their economy, in building their various aspects of their life, and Indian companies have been, Indian government has been involved in capacity building in various sectors, in collaboration with the African countries, whichever area is priority for them. So, whether it's health, whether it's agriculture, whether it's e-governance or rural electrification, agriculture, India has been involved in a big way in these African countries.
And Dr. Beri, going into the specifics, Dr. S. Jaishankar, India's External Affairs Minister, has been saying that our current and future priorities in Africa are in three broad areas: green, meaning green energy and green growth, and tackling climate change and those sort of issues. Two, healthcare, and the third is digital, which includes digital services, fintech, and all these things. So these three are the focus areas right now, and presumably going by the 3 C's formula you just mentioned, this is what African governments, African people, African organizations and institutions are asking for as their priorities, or have identified them. So that's why we are focusing on these, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. These are the areas which are priority for the African countries. This is what the African Development Bank says, and each of the African countries is also looking at these areas. COVID has made health a priority area for every country in the world. They've realized that health is an important area where they need to expand their infrastructure, build their capacities, and Africa is no different. And while India and Africa have been cooperating on health issues for a very long time, it's nothing new. It's not just the COVID that led to India's cooperation on health, but obviously it has escalated India's cooperation with the African countries on the health sector. India is known as the pharmacy of the world, and a large number of Indian companies are represented, pharmaceutical companies are represented in Africa, and so for the pharma sector.
And green
again, given the fact
solar
that
electricity,
given
we've
the
been
fact
doing a
that
lot.
now the world is moving towards a transition towards greener development. We are focusing towards clean energy. So again, our focus is on solar development, solar energy, renewable energy, of which India is the third largest power representative country in the world, which has the
and so many African villages have been electrified with Indian solar power generation.
Definitely, India's not just in terms of the LOC projects which have been involved in setting up manufacturing plants for solar modules and others, but also at a civil society level. Some of India's NGOs have been involved in a big way in lighting up Africa. There is the project which have been launched by a number of NGOs from India.
Like Barefoot College.
Like the Barefoot College.
And tech is the new area where
tech
Africa
is the
and
new
India can do a
area.
lot.
India has had a digital revolution. We have revolutionized the way we deal with e-commerce or with e-governance, and these are the models which are finding a lot of resonance in the African countries. And
I heard a lot of the digital payment systems that we have designed have been adopted across the continent. Many countries are interested in the India stack
Yeah.
open source software by which they can deliver welfare benefits to the poor and those sorts
That's
of things.
true.
So these are really concrete things where India seems to be making a difference. So viewers, there are the 3 C's, but there is also a lot of trade, commerce and investment between India and Africa, and that's been growing, and this is a healthy sign for the relationship. Dr. Beri was saying it's not a donor recipient relationship anymore, and there is equal economic exchange between the 2 sides, and it's growing. So on this I have a video about trade and investment and what more India can do for Africa from Dr. Chisom Ubabukoh. He's a Nigerian economist who teaches at OP Jindal Global University. Let's hear him and continue the discussion.
India and Africa have always been friends, always been friendly, but this has been strengthened in recent times by the resolve of the current administration with the establishment of the India-African Summit Forum that has really helped to solidify this relationship even further. India-Africa trade has been very robust, worth over $100 billion. This is not insignificant. It's quite comparable to India-American trade or India-European trade, for example. So Africa has been a very good trading partner. India has done a lot, a tremendous deal in terms of helping Africa's development. For example, by extending lines of credit worth over $12 billion for the establishment of special economic zones and industrial sectors in all kinds of knowledge transfers, human capital development in the fields of business, entrepreneurship, education, healthcare, agriculture, so many different fields. So they've done a tremendous amount. More could be done, perhaps, in terms of the physical infrastructure like highways, railways, ports, etc. This is one way to warm your hearts into the African, the minds of the African people. I also think that the reach could be improved. More African nations can be reached, and the impact of this development assistance can be felt in more areas. Also, in terms of knowledge transfers, especially in manufacturing and the entire manufacturing value chain, that can also be improved. If this relationship is strengthened, India will benefit a great deal because Africa is a large market, a very extensive market. Africa will also benefit a tremendous deal from the huge knowledge base that India has from its years of development experience, which has been exemplified by the wonderful way it's been leading the G20, representing all of us in the global south.
So viewers, you got a small snapshot of various economic areas where India and Africa are cooperating from Dr. Chisom Ubabukoh. Dr. Beri, Dr. Ubabukoh was talking about manufacturing in Africa. This has been one of the major concerns and the priorities for the African Union and for individual countries as well, because they have been primary products based economies largely, historically speaking, and for them to make the leap to manufacturing, there is India has been supporting special economic zones he was talking about in a number of countries like Ethiopia, for example, and there is also power as well as fertilizer and such sectors where we have set up actually helped set up manufacturing and processing right there in Africa, but that seems to be like the next frontier where India can support. Our investors are quite bullish about Africa. I was hearing Sunil Bharti Mittal, the chairman of the Airtel Group, which is operating in 14 countries in Africa in telecom sector, and he was saying that Africa is like the next bastion of global growth, and it's the fastest growing continent, and with such a young demographic, and there's huge anticipation that the middle class will grow from 300 million to 500 million or 600 million out of a total population of 1.2 billion on the continent. So from that perspective, how would you see India's engagement in trade and investment and what more? I mean, the trade volumes have gone up now to almost $90 billion, and Dr. Ubabukoh was saying that it's comparable roughly to our trade with even the European Union or the US. So Africa is very important, and it's no less than any of the developed parts of the world for us economically. And Indian cumulative investments, I was looking up the data, is about $74 billion in the last 2 decades on the African continent. So our FDI has also gone in, and of course much more will be needed. So your thoughts on the economic, the core economic trade and investment, and what more we can do with the Africans?
Yeah, but see, Africa has over the last 2 decades really changed. In the image of Africa has changed globally. Because there was a time when people used to call Africa as the dark continent, but now Africa is a rising continent, continent of hope, continent of progress, and the fact that among the 10 fastest growing economies, 5 are from Africa today. That's what the IMF says. Shows that that Africa is very different from what has been what has been the traditional narrative. That's changing now about Africa. If you visited the African countries, you could see the progress in these countries, and therefore naturally you were saying that Indian businesses are interested. Definitely, they know that this is the future continent. This is where the last bastion of economic growth, and we need to be involved in these processes. And the other point which you mentioned was about India's now focusing on helping or supporting the African objective of industrialization.
Yes.
So that I think has been there in India's efforts, in India's development partnership also. We can see that I can give you some examples from Africa.
Yes.
Like in case of Ghana, the first sugar factory was set up with the support of India. Then secondly, India was involved in Djibouti for setting up their first cement factory, Mauritania for the first milk processing plant. So India has been doing a lot of things in Africa. Some of them are not known to a lot of people because India has not been advertising that in a big way. It's only now that in the last 5 years that we've had high level visits to Africa, which showcase the fact that India is interested in Africa. We have circumvented the visibility deficit that India had for a long time with the African countries, and which is very important when you're talking about trade and investment relations, that if the government of the country showcases the fact that it is interested in engaging with these set of countries, that gives the businesses also confidence to move into that sector, that region in a big way. And I've been part of the CII Africa country experts committee for a very long time, and the business, the India Incorporate, has been very much interested in doing business with Africa for a long time, and they are even now very much interested in enhancing their presence in the continent.
And it's being facilitated. Our Exim Bank and all these play a big role in enabling two-way trade and investments.
Yeah, they started with the Focus Africa program in the beginning of the century, 2002, when the government said that they will support the increase of exports to Africa by India, and subsequently all the various initiatives that have been launched in terms of enhancing India's trade with the African countries, or India's economic cooperation with African countries. So many summits. We've had now a structured engagement with the African countries with the India-Africa Forum Summit starting in 2008, and the last one 2015. We made it to we opened it to all African countries, all 54 of them. So it was not just the government-to-government summit, but also the businesses from all these countries have been involved in a big way, and they are interested in doing business with India. Why? Because they understand that the style of cooperation that India offers to the African countries is unique.
Yes.
It's unique because we are transferring our model of AAA model, which I say, which is adaptable. We offer them technology which is not offered by a number of countries, which is affordable, which is adaptable. These are some of the reasons why Indian companies are very welcome.
Absolutely. And we have of course other big powers, Western countries, China. I mean, many of them have done very controversial economic interventions in Africa, plundered the natural wealth and resources of the continent, and clearly our approach is quite distinct, and a different model altogether. So viewers, India is doing a lot of good and also receiving a lot of benefits from Africa. It's mutually beneficial, and that's an important point. But apart from economics, there's also peace and security, and this is one area where India has been a major pillar of support for African countries and African people over the years. Let's hear from Ruchita Beri, India's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Ruchita Beri, talking about the India's approach to Africa's peace and security, and we'll resume the discussion after this.
Terrorist outfits like armed groups deserve the priority attention of the Council in their response to addressing security threats confronting Africa today. In the Sahel and throughout the Lake Chad Basin region, as well as in Somalia and beyond, African states face persistent threats of terrorism from groups affiliated with the Al-Qaeda and Daesh. National and regional security forces are the prime responders to combat terrorism. Capacity constraints and lack of financial resources have, however, become major impediments in the fight against terrorism. Initiatives such as ATMIS, the G5 Sahel Joint Force, the South African Development Community Mission in Mozambique, and the Multinational Joint Task Force need more encouragement from the international community. UN peacekeeping operations and special political missions in Africa need to be appropriately mandated and resourced. Our experience in peacekeeping in Africa shows that such missions often struggle to implement ambitious and under-resourced mandates. Furthermore, peacekeeping missions should have a clear and well-thought-out exit strategy prepared in consultation with national and regional stakeholders. Since the 1960s, Indian peacekeepers have served in 22 missions in Africa so far. Currently, Indian peacekeepers are serving in 8 UN peacekeeping missions in the African continent. India has also contributed towards the training and capacity building of peacekeepers from Africa. India believes that Africa's rise is essential for true multipolarity in the global order that we are committed to.
So viewers, you heard from India's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Ruchita Beri, about the issues of peace and security on the continent and India's views, India's preferences, both bilaterally and multilaterally, how we can better secure and create stability and peace on the African continent. Dr. Beri, Africa has changed, but there still are pockets on the continent where there have been persistent armed conflicts, and now this jihadist threat has also arisen and has grown, especially after the Libya collapse in 2011. The fallout of it has been pretty bad in the Sahel region and all that. So India, of course, there's a lot of joint exercises now we are doing with the African armed forces. The AF index, military, we had I think more than 24 African countries jointly training with the Indian armed forces. We do naval exercises with the number of countries, especially the ones along the Indian Ocean coast, the eastern coast of Africa. We've done trilateral ones with Mozambique, with Tanzania and Kenya and all these countries. So obviously there's a lot of capacity building even in the security sphere that we're doing for African countries. But of course there's much more that we could do. And so your thoughts on the peace and security situation there. I mean, there are foreign actors, external actors and interventions which have often destabilized Africa, but India does not at all come with that intention or effect at all. So it's actually to counter the destabilization. So how do you think we have been doing on this front?
Yeah, so you're very right when you say that there are a lot of security issues which still continue in Africa. Conflicts are still simmering in some parts of Africa, like in South Sudan or in Democratic Republic of Congo. There are terrorist groups which are present in Nigeria, in the Sahel region, in North Africa, in countries like Libya. There are in Horn of Africa, Somalia we've seen the presence of terror groups there which have impacted the neighboring countries like Kenya and Uganda. And in southern Africa, we have the emergence of a few years back another terror
in
outfit
Mozambique.
in
Yeah.
Mozambique.
Yeah.
You know, so terrorism is something. Countering terrorism is something which is common between India and African countries. The other common threat is that of maritime insecurity, whether it's maritime terrorism, whether it's piracy, whether it's drug trafficking and other issues of maritime nature, or illegal fishing, in which India and the African countries share a common concern. So these have led to in an enhancement of India's cooperation in security area with the African countries. Traditionally, I would say the focus of India's security cooperation or defense cooperation with the African countries has been on human resource development. That has been the buzzword of India's partnership with the African countries. Similar in the security field. If you recall, the former president of Nigeria was trained in one of our training
Military
institutions.
academies, yeah.
And similarly, the former leader of Ghana. You know, so there have been a history of cooperation between India and the African countries in terms of support that India has given in enhancing the capacities of the African defense officers, cadres. We've also sent training teams to some of the African countries, military training teams,
Yes.
whenever they have desired that their presence is needed.
Right.
And also help them set up the national defense colleges in some countries.
That's right. And even forensic university, there's a new one that Dr. Jaishankar has inaugurated in Uganda.
Yeah, that's the first for India.
For policing and crime and all these things.
Yeah.
So security sector is one area where India and Africa face challenges, and there are ways by which India is continuing to try and build the capacities of our African sisters and brothers so that they can live in more peace and stability. Viewers, you heard from Dr. Ruchita Beri so many facets of India's cooperation with Africa. Do think about the 3 C's that she has mentioned, and how India is a force for good and is partnering with Africa in the best traditions of South-South cooperation. As G20 president, also we have consulted a lot with the Africans and brought their concerns to the table of the major economies of the world, so that African voices and African concerns do not remain neglected. I want to thank Dr. Ruchita Beri for sharing important insights and for letting us know about the future of this important close collaboration with Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shreeram.
Viewers, Africa is important. That's the biggest message of this show and the discussion. Do not underestimate Africa. Africa is rising and India is there shoulder to shoulder. Continue to follow this relationship. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.